All right, welcome everyone. I'm going to get us started. Thank you again for joining us for our second annual Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. My name is Kaylee Pratt. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Partnership for Strong Communities. And I'm also joined today by my colleagues, Chelsea Ross and Danielle Hughley, who are also providing some support for this session. This year, the Partnership for Strong Communities is hosting a 3-day conference with sessions featuring local, state, and national experts, leading conversations that explore challenges, share best practices, and coalesce us around critical next steps to address key affordable housing issues in our state. Join the conversation at hashtag CAHC 2021 on Twitter and follow us at PSC Housing at PSC Housing if you haven't already. This session is titled Ripple Effects, Exploring the Toll of Evictions on Connecticut's Communities, and is part of the Partnership for Strong Communities IForum Series. We would like to thank our leading sponsors, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority and the Melville Charitable Trust. Their deep support has allowed this conference to happen again this year. And thank you also to our collaborating sponsors, the Connecticut Department of Housing, Webster Bank, and Rockport Mortgage. We have many supporting sponsors that have helped make this conference happen, including Beacon Communities, Corporation for Supportive Housing, Elm City Communities, Fairfield County's Community Foundation, Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, JHM Group, LISC, National Equity Fund, and Trinity Financial. And last but not least, a big thank you to this session sponsor, which is Liberty Bank and Bank of America. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. All right, great. Before we get started, I just want to do a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, and we will make all recordings available following the conference. The session is also being broadcast on CTN. All participants have entered muted. Please remain on mute unless you are asked to come off of mute by the speakers. If you have any technology issue, please select the chat icon in the Zoom control panel and send it to the chat. Send a chat to PSC Zoom meetings. We will do our best to assist you. And we ask that you please use the Q&A feature in your Zoom panel to submit any content-related questions to the speaker. So today's conversation will focus on the long-term impacts of evictions on people and their communities. We know that Connecticut has long had an eviction crisis, with 4 Connecticut cities ranking among the top 100 evicting cities across the United States. And this is even prior to COVID. We also know that evictions disparately impact communities of color, especially low-income women of color. COVID has only exacerbated the risk of eviction and homelessness among the cost-burdened. Today, we hope to leave this conversation with a deeper understanding of the human experience of eviction and how it impacts people's mental and physical health, their future housing availability and quality, education, and so much more. We also hope that looking at the human experience will generate new perspective that can drive and shape policies surrounding evictions. I have the pleasure of introducing our wonderful moderator, Sophie House. She is the Director of Law and Policy at Housing Solutions Lab at NYU Furman Center. She has a wealth of knowledge in housing instability, housing policy, and evictions. And we're so excited to have her here, as well as the rest of our wonderful panel today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sophie to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaylee. It's great to be here. So thank you so much for having me. As Kaylee mentioned, I work with mostly with small and mid-sized cities on a wide range of issues related to racial equity, opportunity, and health, including housing instability and eviction prevention. I also grew up in Connecticut and went to law school here. So I'm very excited to be in conversation with our panelists today. Before we get into our conversation, I just want to ground us in some sort of foundational understandings of the harms of evictions. The pandemic, of course, has highlighted the precarious position that many low-income renters are in across the country and here in Connecticut, as well as the stakes of housing instability for individuals and for families. So thinking about the harms of evictions, as a threshold matter, we know that over both the short and the long term, evictions are harmful for individuals, for families, and for communities. And really a robust body of research now shows that evictions are not just associated with, but in fact, the cause of many adverse health and economic outcomes for both children and adults. A recent study out of New York City, for example, found that evictions cause large and persistent increases in the risk of homelessness and exacerbate long-term residential instability. And importantly, this research showed that evictions lead to a lasting difference in the odds of experiencing homelessness altogether. So in other words, preventing evictions doesn't just delay a period of inevitable future homelessness, but actually decreases a family or a person's odds of ever being homeless at all. And the same authors also found that evictions lead to worse health outcomes, particularly with respect to mental health and increased emergency room use. There are a lot of pathways, obviously, through which evictions can affect mental health and other health outcomes. The most obvious is the stress of the eviction process and of housing instability writ large. But more broadly, evictions and the cost that they impose on households, for example, the need to pay for another security deposit or for moving expenses or to take time off of work to attend court proceedings, can force households to cut spending on things like preventative medical care. The effects of evictions are especially acute for children who experience both the emotional and developmental trauma of losing their homes unexpectedly, as well as educational disruptions when they're moved across school systems. Yet households with children are more likely to be evicted than those without children. And to give a sense of how common the experience of eviction has become for children in America, a study of families with children born between 1998 and 2000 found that 1 in 7 of those children across the study experienced eviction before they turned 15. And among those children who were born into deep poverty, the figure was 1 in 4 children experienced eviction before age 15. We'll also talk today about the ways in which communities are affected by the eviction process. Evictions limit evicted households' abilities to find safe, stable, and affordable housing once they're evicted. This is partially due to the fact that in most places, landlords can and do screen tenants based on their past involvement in housing court. And tenants are often screened out of housing on that basis, regardless of whether they won or lost their court cases, so to speak. Low-income people of color are disproportionately evicted and then have a narrower set of options, generally lower quality housing in lower opportunity neighborhoods when they try to find new housing. And these processes reproduce segregation and the concentration of poverty at community levels. As Kaylee mentioned, and I want to reiterate before our conversation, an important baseline truth just to establish and understand when we talk about eviction is that race, class, and gender profoundly shape who is most vulnerable to eviction. In particular, the eviction process disproportionately affects low-income renters, renters of color, and women. Racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression shape the conditions that create economic and social vulnerability to eviction. They're present in tenants' interactions with real estate brokers, with landlords, and with administrative agencies, and also affect the treatment that tenants receive within the legal system. Black women are evicted at higher rates than any other population, and children born to Black and Hispanic mothers are significantly more likely to experience evictions than children born to mothers of other racial groups. And at the neighborhood level, research from the Eviction Lab has shown that neighborhood racial composition is a predictor of eviction rates, even after controlling for incomes and property values. holding incomes and property values constant as the share of the Black population in a neighborhood increases, the eviction rate increases as well. So we have some panelists today who will be able to shed light on these, the ways that evictions affects individuals, families, and communities from their experiences on the ground. It's really an honor to be here with two such esteemed practitioners who are working to both to prevent evictions and to mitigate the harms and provide assistance to tenants experiencing housing instability across Connecticut. And so I will just briefly introduce them and ask them to share a bit about who they are and the perspective they bring. So I'll start with Cecil Thomas. Cecil, can you tell us about yourself and your work briefly?
Sure. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you for that wonderful introduction to the landscape of evictions, both in Connecticut and broadly. I'm an attorney at Greater Hartford Legal Aid, where I've spent my career representing low-income individuals in the Greater Hartford area, predominantly in housing. A significant amount of that representation is focused on representing tenants facing eviction, but also related issues dealing with housing stability and housing conditions. I am currently the president of the Connecticut Bar Association and have been very active in the CBA's access to justice initiatives, as well as our diversity and inclusion work. And so thrilled to be here and thrilled to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now I'd like to introduce Sylvia Cooper. Sylvia, will you tell us about yourself and your work?
Yes, good morning, everyone. I have 3 roles. I'm from the New Haven area. I am a crisis counselor for the Ministerial Health Fellowship, and this is based in Middletown, Connecticut, and I represent the greater New Haven area. My primary targeted population is people who are challenged with substance use and mental health. And in addition to that, I work with the Amati Breakthrough Project. It's a partnership with my church, Varick Memorial AME Zion Church, with Yale University School of Psychiatry. And I'm also a resident of New Haven, and I've worked with a lot of families and individuals who have been faced with evictions during their lifetime.
Thank you. Yeah, you both wear so many hats that I think we're getting about 6 panelists for the price of 2. So this is great. The first question to give, hoping to give the participants a sense of what the eviction process really is like for tenants who go through it. So maybe each of you sort of speaking from your own window into that process, could you tell us a bit about if you were a tenant who had to go through an eviction in Connecticut, what might you experience? Maybe we'll start with you, Cecil.
Sure. So when I talk about evictions, I'll talk in this segment about the legal process. So typically an eviction is started with a notice to quit, which is not filed in court, but which is a 1-page document, typically informing the tenant that their lease is terminated for one of the reasons allowed in the statute. And typically pre-pandemic would provide them with a 3-day quit period. That's been extended by Governor Lamont's latest executive orders to a 30-day period. But again, the legal landscape for evictions is one which is extremely expedited. So typically civil legal process in Connecticut advances every 30 days. In evictions, which are called summary process, the pleadings advance every 3 days. And so the process is designed to move quickly and under the case law to provide landlords with an expedited remedy to allow them to recover possession of their leased premises when there's a dispute. That notice to quit typically has an effect. And so to your point, Sophie, about the long-term and lasting impact of evictions, many tenants, and this isn't easily measured, but many tenants anecdotally will receive those notices to quit, will understand that an eviction is in the pipeline, and will then decide to move. And so certainly at the height of COVID-19, some of the rationale for limiting the right of landlords to resort to notices to quit and to evictions was because of that effect, that upon serving a notice to quit, you would have tenants who would then leave, and the studies would show that they would typically double and triple up. They might end up in the shelter system, which again at the time was not particularly equipped, given social distancing and COVID-19 concerns, to deal with the current homeless population, let alone a new influx of newly homeless individuals. And then typically after that notice to quit, the tenant will be served what's called a summons and complaint. They'll provide them with a date upon which they have to file paperwork with the court, informing the court that they intend to represent themselves and present a defense. They will then be invited to present that defense in writing and then to attend the mediation, which pre-pandemic was typically on a Monday or Tuesday here in Hartford, and would have 100 plus tenants, their families, oftentimes their children's with them in court, waiting for their case to be called and to meet with a mediator. Looking broadly at the landscape of evictions, median time frame for disposition of an eviction in Connecticut pre-pandemic was 26 days. 37% of tenants default, meaning that they lose their case for failing to appear. And so what that means is they never have the chance to present that defense, to meet with a mediator, to maybe have their day in court before a judge. And then the legal representation rates are also really significant in the disparity that exists there. And so some 80% of landlords are represented by counsel, compared to just 7% of tenants who are represented by attorneys. And so again, in the context of an extremely expedited, statutorily defined legal process, the balance that's built into that system, which is one of due process, is really dependent upon access to counsel. And so the lack of access to counsel for tenants at every stage of the proceeding, to be able to say, these are your defenses, these are your potential defenses you can raise, and then this is what a fair settlement and a reasonable settlement might look like in cases where that's appropriate, which addresses both the concerns and considerations of the landlord, but also the concerns and considerations of the tenant. In my experience, although the case that typically presents is one about non-payment of rent, there's usually a lot more going on. And I often think of evictions as kind of the equivalent of a medical emergency in the legal context, which is, a host of issues have combined. There's oftentimes an underlying dispute between the landlord and tenant. Oftentimes that's about the issues like repairs. And so, a tenant will exercise either properly or improperly their right, for example, to withhold rent, which is a limited right, because of a dispute about repairs or conditions in the apartment. The landlord then can serve a notice to quit as early as the 11th day of the month. And so if you, as they say, are a day late or $1 short, once you pass the statutory grace period of rent being due by the 10th with the grace period, a landlord can serve a notice to quit on that 11th day in a typical lease. And so then, the context in which you are in the court is one where, as a tenant, you are on the defensive, where you have to both defend your failure or withholding of the rent, as well as attempt to assert within that defensive context, as well as that expedited context, the defenses that you might have. And so it really is an unsettling legal process. And again, on the back end, once the case has reached disposition, the statute only provides a 5-day stay of execution. And so if judgment has entered against you, the judge can give you as little as 5 days by which you have to remove your possessions, by which the judgment can be enforced. And then a marshal will then get permission from the court to serve you with what's called an execution. And that execution is a piece of paper giving you typically as little as 24 hours notice of the date and time on which that marshal is going to return to your apartment to physically remove yourself, your family members, as well as your property. That is then placed typically on the sidewalk where it's coordinated with the town or municipality where you're located for them to come pick up your property. And then you typically have a limited window to redeem that property if you don't have other storage options available to you. At which point, if you don't redeem it within that period of time, typically that property will be at certain intervals put up for auction by the town. And so you can think about all of this happening in some cases as little as a month from being in your home and understanding your sort of that broader conception of home to a situation where you might find yourself with a martial order, date and time for you to be removed physically from your home, and really think about not just the legal consequences, but also sort of the broader familial, psychological, family and community stability implications as well.
Thanks, Cecil. Sylvia, we'd love for you to come in here.
Okay, so thank you, Cecil, for that very good description of what a family goes through legally for eviction. So I do want to focus on the 37% of folks who don't go through the proper procedures of going through the eviction process. So let's look at the New Haven demographics and geographics of a family and where folks live at. So a lot of the times in my experience working in transitional housing, working with this population, what does a family composition look like? What is their income background? A lot of families are now living with addictions who are still part of the family with their income. They're single parent households. There are children who are about to go to college or in college, and families are still trying to meet those needs. And they're just uneducated tenants who don't even know that they even have a right to even respond to the notice to quit. Why do people have notice to quit? There can be various reasons. And in my experience, I've seen this. The question you ask someone who comes to this shelter or transitional housing, one, we know that addiction plays a big part on finances. Let's say a family who doesn't have addictions or mental health, that you ask them in an assessment, why did you leave? And they just simply said, well, I thought the notice to quit meant I had to leave my apartment. But it is the biggest bill of the families. Someone had a flat tire and it took them to get another tire, $150 out of their rent money that they're paying $1,000 to $1,200 a month. And there's no replacement for those dollars. And so now they find themselves by the 18th of the month falling back, and they have 12, 13 more days to pay the rent, and now they're behind because there's no substituting what they took to fix the tire. And instead of the landlord or tenants going to the landlord and says, I'm in a bind right now, can I have a payment arrangement if the landlord wants to do that? They find themselves getting behind every week until they go to the second month, and now they're at the point of eviction. And so it's a lack of education. It's a lack of advocacy and education that they can respond to the notice to quit to have their day in court. And as Cecil noted, that most tenants or people who are in eviction court don't have the right to counsel. It's either through legal aid, who have cases, so many cases that they don't have enough time to represent the individual because the landlord has already moved towards the eviction process. And a lot of the burdens of that process is added to the tenant. So you have the late fees, you have the back rent, and now if they pay for a marshal, if they pay for an attorney, that now goes into the burden to the person who's being evicted family. It is emotional for children to come home and found what used to be normal to them is no longer normal because the family has to abruptly leave what they called home and go somewhere else. And sometimes that's a shelter. Sometimes that's on another family member couch. And some families find themselves having to separate their family just to have some kind of shelter over the family's head. So it's a real kind of, it's a roller coaster ride for most people. It's emotional, it's financial, and there's the physical part of relocating folks just so they can have a roof over their heads.
Cecil, did you want to come in there? Okay. Thank you both. Yeah, I think hearing both about how intimidating and overwhelming the housing court process can be, for the eviction process can be for tenants who have to navigate that process without a lawyer. Cecil, it's extremely instructive, and Sylvia, thank you for highlighting, so many of the ways in which evictions compromise households' financial stability, emotional well-being. And I want to, first I want to highlight too, I believe there's another, I know there will be another panel session at this conference about access to counsel, expanding the right to counsel in eviction proceedings for tenants in Connecticut. So if you are interested in hearing more about that move to expand the tenant representation, I encourage you to attend that session. And Sylvia, I wonder if we could stay with you for a moment and delve even just a little bit more into some of the lasting impacts on individuals and families, and in particular on children who experience evictions, since you have had the experience of working with so many people going through evictions firsthand.
Okay, so let's say a family has to go through the CAN access the 211 to get a family in a shelter, which means that the family I believe in most of the state, if a family is living in a shelter, they can't force a child to leave their school district. They'll have to work out transportations so the children are going to their same schools. But let's say a family doesn't live in a shelter and there's magnet school, interdistrict magnet schools, and then there's community-based schools, charter schools. And so it depends on where your child goes to school at. So now if a family let's say that flat tire now turns into the fact that you're a month and behind, you need car repairs or anything. Now your children don't have any transportation to get to auntie's house because their school is in another district. And the family has to now go to work. And so, trying to figure everything out. Children are really impacted. It's one, it comes with embarrassment. Your whole neighbors watch everything that's inside your home come out into the streets. It's embarrassing. What was normal isn't normal anymore. Just the uproar of just the routine, whatever routine the family have. Children are going to school. They're trying to get their way back and forth to school. What they know to be a routine is no longer routine. And it's also even more traumatizing when the family already has issues within the family. They're just holding on by a thin thread, and now this happens. So the impact is greater. They may have to, if they do find another apartment, they may have to even downsize even more, where they had a 3 or 4 bedroom, and now they're in a 2-bedroom with with 4 children with different ages and different genders, and everyone's cramming into the same room just to accommodate the family so they can have somewhere to stay. And not be homeless. So let's say Johnny is playing on the junior varsity basketball team. That's a positive outlet to him. But because of the different where they live, the family routine has changed. He has now got to give that up. Or if he's in creative arts, or if he's in something that works for him or her, they now have to come home and make sure that the younger siblings are cared for, because the support systems that they had in their old neighborhood or for the family are no longer existing. And so just for the family to make it, because housing is the biggest piece for a family. You have housing, you may not be able to eat a lot of food, but you got soup and crackers, but you can't eat those soup and crackers if you have nowhere to lay your head. And so the responsibility starts falling on the children. You have latchkey kids. It's just so much that the family has to endure when mom or dad has to go to work to be able to keep housing over their heads, because they had to leave their other housing because something just happened. Or if a family has to take in a elderly parent, and the medical costs, and not everyone gets SNAP benefits. Not everyone is on Husky D, and the out-of-pocket costs when someone got sick and they had to pay a higher premium. Anything that takes away from the rent money can offset the family's entire life changing. So that's how I've seen it impact families.
Yeah, Cecil, please do come in. Thanks, Sylvia.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, so, just in thinking about the very practical experience of eviction pre-pandemic, I highlighted that court was in person. You'd have what was called short calendar. And so that meant that what was commonly referred to as a cattle call, basically, that you'd have, hundreds of tenants facing eviction, their landlords' attorneys, the mediators in court waiting for your case to be called, and possibly have an opportunity to mediate your case with a court-appointed mediator, and then possibly have the opportunity either that day or a day shortly thereafter for an opportunity to present your case before court, before the judge. And then, practically that would create some real issues, which is that if you had to take a full day off for court to be able to be there to wait, if you could be there for the better part of the day, that presented some access issues, assuming that you could get to court on time to be there for the morning call, that your transportation was reliable enough to do so, that you had a job that allowed you to do so. Since the pandemic has started, as courts have reopened for greater amounts of business in the eviction context, we've gone a largely virtual format. But I do want to highlight that, I think that also presents its own sets of issues. I mean, we talk about the digital divide in Connecticut, which is also an issue that tends to have disproportionate impact along poverty lines, along racial lines. So that method of access, which if you're accessing your court proceeding, and what's at stake is your housing, and you have to access that either by video, or if you aren't able to access it by video, by phone, that presents its own challenges, right? If you don't have access to a safe space to do so, if you don't have access to the technology and broadband. There were a few of us that had some technological struggles getting into this conference this morning. Now imagine that what was at stake was your housing, and that your opportunity to decide whether you were going to have that housing or not have that housing after that opportunity. And then also consider the fact that, we're able to engage with each other and have some sense of each other because we're on video and we're presenting by video and in an audio format simultaneously. You get to get a sense of the surroundings, and more importantly, as participants, we get to have some control over how we present ourselves. In the context of a tenant who is accessing a court proceeding by phone, they are doing so not because of a matter of choice, but because that's the only way they can access the court proceeding. The judge then becomes a disembodied voice, but more importantly, they are a disembodied voice. So you can't necessarily see, the exhibits, the documents that are being exchanged. You can't see the judge's face. You can't gauge the reaction that is happening. And similarly, again, not to sort of get too much into the mind of the trial judge there, but the trial judge looking out is not seeing a tenant and understanding their surroundings, getting a sense of what emotion and what experience they're bringing to their testimony, but it's really just hearing a voice that's coming through on phone, which might have technical difficulties of its own. And so some of my colleagues this summer engaged in the court watching process and really tracked the difference in outcomes when an individual participated in eviction only by phone versus participating by video. And overwhelmingly, tenants who are participating only by phone were significantly more likely to have an adverse impact or an adverse outcome in their eviction. And so as we wrestle with what the right forward process is, whether it's some combination of in-person or virtual, that's something to be mindful of, that now the method of access, if there are challenges to accessing public courts before using public transportation, using public buildings, we are now largely on a very private highway. It's a privately paid highway to be able to access the courts. And while that works for many, it doesn't necessarily work for all and presents some new challenges that I think we're still just starting to scratch the surface on.
Thanks, Cecil. And thanks for highlighting the challenges both of ensuring technology access and also, reminding the tenants participating in virtual proceedings, need private, quiet spaces from which to log in order to be able to log in from home and assert their rights as well. And it makes me think of Sylvia's comment about imagine being a family trying to relocate in search of find an affordable 4-bedroom apartment in Connecticut. So I want to ask both of you about, first, what are some of the barriers to finding safe and stable housing following eviction, and how does the availability of affordable housing in Connecticut affect the housing prospects of tenants who have been evicted? Sylvia, yeah, please.
Yeah, so I want to talk about that. The way that New Haven, the greater New Haven area is structured. So you have your Fairhaven Heights, you have your Westville, Beaver Hills, which is all, single homes, homeowners. And the center of the city, you have multifamily houses, you have public housing, and you have folks with Section 8 vouchers. And so we had this thing where, I don't know if we should call it, I should call it predatory. It's like lending, but you have these landlords who hike the price up because they want to get the Section 8 based rent. And so the Section 8 doesn't allow, when I worked for Section 8 years ago, they don't allow landlords to hike the unit up just to get the most they can get for the apartment if it's a 4-unit house. So it has to be across the board. So those who can afford market rent kind of pay the price because landlords only want tenants with the Section 8 voucher. And then you have spaces where they're charging an enormous amount of money for rent with little space to offer to tenants. And then tenants are out there trying to really get the money together. There's shared housing where 2 families come together and they share the space, but when they fall out, someone has to go. And so it just becomes a complicated kind of renting game, if you will, in the city. If I had a wish, if you granted me one wish that I could ask for, and we talk about, when folks are, in home ownership programs, they're mandated to go through these classes and trainings, how to become a homeowner and the do's and the don'ts. Well, I think prevention is the key, that in some cases, some folks need to go through the renting process of taking classes and workshops to be a good renter, but also what happens, teaching budget. And we just assume that folks come packaged like that, and they don't, and they find rent to be the biggest bill, the biggest, the biggest ticket, and they abandon it for some reason. That it causes some large number of our percentage of our homelessness is to leave, not just financially, mentally, they can't take it. So I think that a lot has to do with structure of housing, structuring of the private market. Wait list in New Haven for public housing is 3 and 4, sometimes 5 years, and it's even longer with Section 8. And so we have a mixed population there's a lot of luxury apartments being built in New Haven. There's not enough affordable housing. And even with affordable housing, you'll be surprised, with Section 8 vouchers, people are still being evicted. There has to be some kind of normalcy for people to understand what is the responsibility of the renter, and the same should go to landlords. And when you know that your demographic of folks with low income, not making enough, if their rent is over $1,000 a month, they're only earning between $12,000 and $25,000 a year, they're just barely making it. And so that's, what I've noticed in the renting market in this area of the greater New Haven area.
Thank you, Sylvia. I'll just add very briefly. I mean, pre-pandemic, we had a pretty significant affordability crisis here in Connecticut. 31% of renter households were identified as extremely low income, and 64% of those extremely low income renter households were identified as having a severe cost burden, according to the National Low Income Housing Coalition study of Connecticut. But speaking specifically to evictions, I mean, oftentimes the eviction record itself, which has an ongoing life, both in the eviction, the public records or docket information that's made available by the judicial branch, which is true for any case, right? Any case that's filed is available and for a period of time after it's filed and disposed of, and can be accessed on that judicial website. Oftentimes, the fact that an eviction was brought serves as a further impediment for tenants who are looking to secure alternate housing. And that's true in my experience, even when the outcome of that eviction favored the tenant. So I've had cases where my client prevailed in the eviction, or it was, because it was brought improperly or brought for a basis that didn't ultimately have legs in court. But the mere fact that that case was brought ends up serving as a proxy for a prospective landlord who says, look, I see that an eviction was brought against you. And so, that serves as a basis to screen that tenant out from future housing opportunity. And I think that can be really frustrating because, again, if the goal is for a tenant who is facing that crisis to move to decent, safe, sanitary, affordable housing, that eviction as a barrier to doing so really has some long-lasting impacts, which really stem back to ultimately to the legal record of that eviction.
Thank you both. I want to make sure we have a chance to turn to some of the questions from the audience that I see coming in. So I will just ask you both for, what do you think are the most important next steps, in terms of reform and maybe legislative change that need to be taken to, to change, taken against some of the problems that we've just discussed?
Well, Cecil probably this is his expertise in legal, but for me as a layperson on the ground, boots on the ground walking in terms of grassroots and things like that, I understand that landlords have a right to expect tenants to pay their rent. It's a part of their business. It's a business for them. It's for them to pay their mortgage. But I think given the fact that in some areas, poorer cities, especially minorities across the board, landlords need to be held to more accountability. And as they rent properties, especially when you're renting properties that do not have the standards up to housing quality standards. If someone comes to you and they only earn $15,000 a year and you're charging $1,000 a month, then more than likely they're going to meet them somewhere in eviction court for non-payment of rent. I think that landlords need to know that where they're located, that they're encouraged, not forced, encouraged to give a pamphlet of what they can do to avoid eviction, some conversation between the landlord. They should know, every landlord should know what agencies, nonprofit agencies provide assistance to tenants who fall into this category. This is a relationship between them and their tenants, and their goal is to keep the tenants into the units. Then they should know when you sign your lease, by the way, if you find yourself in this situation, here is a list of agencies that you can go to in the event this happened. We don't want this to happen, but we would certainly like you to know that you can go to this without them feeling like I'm all alone. And then we're talking about credit scores. We're talking about credit reports, which means that they're going to either pay double the security in the next unit, or they cannot find a unit at all because they have an eviction on their record. Their credit is shot, so owning a home is not realistic. And so I think that landlords need to be in good faith, ready to be prepared to help the person stay in the unit, not social workers, not case managers, but at least knowing agencies that people can call to assist them if they find themselves in a situation.
That's excellent. So really engaging and educating landlords and bringing them into this process. Thank you so much, Sylvia. Cecil?
Yeah, I would highlight that I think currently, and this is a bit of a plug for the panel that's taking place later this afternoon, but obviously the eviction right to counsel, we became the third state in the country in Connecticut to adopt a statewide right to counsel. That'll be phased in, and phase-in is expected to begin January 1st. And so, looking at the lessons from other jurisdictions that have adopted right to counsel, it'll take time, and hopefully the funding will be available to ensure that this is an ongoing and growing program. But, looking at New York City, for example, which has been phasing in their program from 2013 to 2019, to the present, between that period of 2013 to 2020, they saw an increase in representation rates from 1% to 38%. And in every jurisdiction that has invested in right to counsel, you've seen very significant statistics in favor of tenants who then are able to avoid disruptive displacement. So something like 92% of tenants who are represented by counsel are able to avoid disruptive displacement, as evidenced, I think, in both Baltimore and Philadelphia, that have done studies of right to counsel initiatives in those cities. And again, that'll be discussed further this afternoon, but I was thrilled to work on that initiative and serve on the advisory council for the new right to counsel program. So I'd be remiss if I didn't make a plug for it. And then also, the existence of Unite CT, the federal funded program here in Connecticut. There was some backlog issues as the program was rolled out back in March, but the federal government has certainly liberalized the program with new guidance over time, and that I think has resulted in more money coming out into the system for landlords. That money is paid to landlords, and I think of that as a far more productive outcome and solution for all of the parties than an eviction. And I say that because evictions are limited to the question of possession. And so, Sylvia made an excellent point about the add-on costs of an eviction. You get the filing fee, you've got the court marshal's fees, you got the movers, you've got the attorney's fees. And so the tenant who then needs to redeem, if they're able to redeem, has to come up with all of those additional sums in addition to, obviously, the rent if rent is due. But from the landlord's perspective, you're investing all of that money in a solution that is only going to get you the apartment back, meaning that if you win the eviction, what you're going to get is possession of your apartment, meaning you're going to have your tenant put out. And so I understand that there's a leverage kind of benefit there, but the additional costs are initially paid by the landlord, and then there isn't a guarantee that those are necessarily paid. The other thing I would highlight is I think housing code enforcement is really important. I was able to work on the relatively recent reforms of the Hartford Housing Code, but boots on the ground, housing code enforcement is really important. And looking at those staffing levels across many of our major cities, which become, I think because of the aging housing stock and some of the issues there, that enforcement of the housing code is really important. Because again, if you are in a situation where your housing is not up to code, is not up to par, as a tenant, what are your options? Your options are to ask for repairs. Maybe that's successful, maybe it's not. If you're not able to get your landlord to do those repairs, then your next call is to housing code. And then the question is, where does that break down? In most cases, you would hope that housing code enforcement, assuming they're adequately staffed and able to come out in a reasonable proximate time to do that inspection, to document the issues and to enforce the code in a productive way. The question is there going to be an eviction in that sequence that then shifts that dynamic in a way that requires the tenant to then try to prove what may or may not be happening in their housing code before judge, rather than finding that more holistic, productive solution that says, look, let's get the rent paid, but let's also make sure that the conditions issues that exist in that apartment are fixed and that that house is brought up to code in a way that works for everybody.
All really important points. And just picking up off of that, Cecil, too, I think that enforcing housing codes equitably and effectively has been just such a longstanding challenge it's just been such a longstanding housing equity challenge, and the need to avoid both sort of punitively over enforcing in particular communities, under enforcing and not, and also the dangers of under enforcing and not ensuring a real right to safe and habitable housing for communities, and also recognizing that a code enforcement system in which the squeaky wheel gets the grease is going to discriminate against those who don't feel empowered to make demands of their local government, or who, are concerned about the precarity of their housing status. So, Sylvia, did you want to?
No, I think Cecil raises a very valid point about the tenants who do live in units who withhold the rent. Some folks are so fearful, they will let a leaky pipe, they will let a leaky ceiling, mold grow, and they said if I have reported it to the Livable City Initiatives, LCI, then my landlord's going to kick me out. And so they live with these conditions that no one should have to live with. I was just working with someone who had a sewer backup in the basement. It's a single family house. The landlord refused to fix it. She had severe asthma, ended up in the hospital. And the landlord said, instead of him offering some kind of resolution, like, you can stay, I'll fix it, stay in a hotel for a few days because it had fumes. I mean, it was just terrible. And he says, well, no, why don't you go stay with some family members? And so, and not really ready to rectify the issue. And it was just in poor taste on the landlord's behalf. And she does have a voucher, and he's getting the market rate for the unit. And then landlords who have tenants who are not with subsidies, if something's wrong, then, rectify it, and you're going to force their hands to, to withhold the rent. But that's not in a lot of cases. People are just afraid. I'd rather just have someone over come in and try to fix it themselves, or just put a pan underneath the sink and let the pipe drip, because I just don't want to cause any bad blood between myself and my landlord. And that's unfortunate.
It is. I think that ties in. I think that's going to tie in with one of the questions that we have from our audience, which is, how does immigration status affect the experience of eviction or housing instability? Would one of you want to start on that one?
I mean, so I think there are two pieces of this. One is for the undocumented population, certainly, as we think about the various programs that were enacted throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Some, but not all of those, had some restriction on immigration status, and that just relates, to government benefits reform in the mid-90s, and has a longer history there that we probably can't fully get into today. But again, to the extent that immigration status represents a point of greater risk, and the likelihood of, the greater likelihood of living on the margin, so to speak, an unsettling effect like COVID-19, which had sort of broad impact across the country, economic impact across the country, and continues to do so, but layered on top of additional instability, can be a really, significantly devastating effect. And now that the eviction processes are more opened up for landlords to resort to, certainly presents a heightened risk of eviction. I'll add to that also that many of the federal housing programs have built into them, and these are, again, there's a lot of comments that highlight the real challenge of getting onto these programs. The wait list for some of these housing programs is years long. And oftentimes many of these have some restriction on the basis of immigration status. And so they do allow for prorated housing assistance for mixed status families. But that can be, legally complicated, and you're relying upon somebody going through several hundreds of pages of a policy manual to understand that that's an important, element to the program that doesn't serve as an absolute bar to a family that has mixed immigration status. So certainly, it adds to the risk, and we certainly saw that, during the pandemic in particular, with the opening of specific programs that were targeted for the undocumented population, but also just the challenge of accessing some of the benefits that go back well beyond the pandemic, and will continue to be an issue going forward.
Thanks, Cecil. Sylvia, is there anything you would want to add to that, thinking about the interaction of evictions and immigration status?
Well, I think Cecil has the legal response, and that's not my expertise, but I can say that it is one of the fast growing population who live in overcrowded housing. It's unfortunate. It could be a family of 8 living in a 2-bedroom. and it's very overcrowded for them. And it can range from grandparents to children who are infant to toddler, and it's like 8, 9 people in a and they do fear being deported. They face deportations, and landlords know this, and they will milk it until it doesn't matter to them. Like, as long as they get their rent, then that's fine. But they live in overcrowded apartments, and I think that the landlords they take advantage of the fact that people are afraid of being deported. So that's what I've seen.
Thank you so much. Just one more question from the audience before we wrap up today. The question is, what role can agencies and all community organizations, Sylvia, I know that you have worked with a wide range of those at the local level, but what role can agencies or other organizations play in ensuring that landlords have the education about and awareness of the kinds of programs that are available to serve tenants? And we can even sort of, think we can broaden that a little bit too and think about, how can other agencies or other kind of players in this landscape help educate and engage, bring landlords into the process, or introduce some of that accountability too, we've talked about.
Yeah, so in some areas across the state, they have landlord engagement specialists where they act as the liaison between the tenant, especially in the shelters, with potential landlords who will take a risk on a family who's had evictions on their records. I think that it's the same way that property owners feel like they want to invest into their property. It would be wonderful if they invest into their tenants, and if they at free will would come to a workshop or a not a seminar, just like in the open house, and hear what the type of folks that you're going to be renting to. I think the investment in human beings and understanding, there's a broad range of why people are, it could be income, it can be other things, without compromising the confidentiality of potential tenants. But I think if you're going to live, or if you're going to have property, especially for people who do not live in Connecticut, you have landlords who live out of state and they're renting properties, and they may have a rental agency, a property management company representing them. I think from the whoever's representing them, and if you plan to rent to people especially in the Black and brown communities or anywhere, you should it's an investment of just being a good human being, to hear what are the things that they can do to make sure that tenants are living in a place that's fair, that's affordable in terms of just being able to be affordable, but more than anything, that they can live as a tenant, pay their rent, and understand that if folks find themselves facing eviction for something legitimate, then they can work with nonprofit agencies to make sure they can avoid the eviction process. And that's something that can benefit the landlord as well as the potential resident or tenant who's living in their property.
Yeah, absolutely.
So education.
And this is terrific. And I know we're really we're right just over our time. So Cecil, if you have if you don't mind the crunch, if you have a speedy answer.
Sure, yeah, very quickly. So and there's some comments, and I would tend to agree with them, that expansion of existing programs like the rental assistance programs and the Section 8 program, and adequately funding them is really important. I just want to tie together a thread from some other comments as well, which is I also think that part of the solution is really looking at these programs and considering whether they constitute the overregulation of poverty. Right? You can get on these programs, and then there's so many different ways. I mean, for you to be tripped up as a participant, you got to collect your annual income every year. You got to go through the recertification process. And when we think about comparing that to home ownership, if that's viewed in this country as a traditional path to into wealth, into long-standing wealth, that the programs that we create should have some element of the stability in cost and stability in intersection with the program that create that long-term ability to move from poverty into wealth acquisition. And that, isn't sort of an immediate, well, you've had a nominal increase in your rent, and so therefore income, so therefore your rent has to go up. When I think about sort of my periods of life, a big part of my family's journey had to do with the fact that we were able to live in the same third family apartment for 13 years just outside of Boston, right? And that our rent remained largely the same during that period of time when I was growing up. So that was my childhood home. And if I went and talked to my parents, we still talk about that period of time in our lives when we had a stable landlord who really never increased the rent for that 13-year period, that then allowed us to spring forward into better circumstances. So do we have programs that recreate that opportunity and that recreate that stability? And I don't think we're quite there yet, but I would tend to agree that expansion of those programs in a common sense way and making them accessible to a broader segment of the population is really important for where we are in Connecticut right now.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Cecil. Yeah, a great summation of just the both the difficulty, but also the urgency of creating stability and really wealth building opportunities for renters. Yeah, much to address in the rest of the conference, I'm sure, but thank you. We'll wrap up there, and I will turn it back over to the folks at PSC.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sophie, Sylvia, and Cecil. This was a great conversation. I feel like that hour flew by. So thank you to the attendees who are still with us. I know we're a little over time, but we really appreciate you sticking around for such a great conversation. I wanted to note that the conference session that folks had recommended earlier in this discussion, the right to counsel, is this afternoon at 2 p.m. and that features Connecticut Fair Housing, Connecticut Bar, Connecticut Right to Counsel Coalition, and the Hampton City Council. So please, if you are available to join us later on for a deeper discussion of the right to counsel, please do join us for that. And I will note that our next conference session starts at 11:30. So if you're sticking around with us, please grab a coffee and stick around. That one is, does the road to integration run through your town? And again, just the biggest gratitude to our panelists. And I will also add to Danielle Hughley, who helped pull this session together. And it was just a really great conversation. So thank you. And we will see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.